Hello Daily Drafters, and welcome to the Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth Limited Archetype Guide here on the Daily Draft channel. This video will cover everything you need to know to prepare for your first drafts of the new set when it releases on MTG Arena on Tuesday, June the 20th. Get ready to amass some information as you get tempted by this content. Let's dive in. Before we look at our first archetype for this video, let's go over the new and returning mechanics for this set so we have an idea what we're dealing with. So I've got good news and bad news when it comes to the first new mechanic on our list. The good news is that it's really the only actual new mechanic in the entire set. The bad news is that it's an exhaustive one. So let's learn about what happens when the ring tempts you. The first time that the ring tempts you during a game, you get an emblem named the ring. You'll see a copy of this card on your screen now. The first time the ring tempts you, the ring gains its first ability, which says that your ring bearer is legendary and can't be blocked by creatures with greater power. Easy enough, but what's a ring bearer? Well, each time the ring tempts you, you choose a creature you control to become your ring bearer. This creature will remain your ring bearer until you choose another one or until it leaves the battlefield. When the ring tempts you again, you have the ability to choose a new ring bearer or have your current ring bearer remain your ring bearer. As the ring tempts you further, your emblem will gain its next abilities until it has gained all 4 abilities. Once your ring has all 4 of its abilities, it has reached its full power and won't gain additional abilities as the ring tempts you in the future. There will be spells and abilities that refer to your ring bearer, so be sure to choose wisely each time you're tempted. With the most confusing new mechanic out of the way, the only other new mechanic we have is Amass Orcs, and it really isn't exactly new. For those of you that remember War of the Spark, we had a mechanic called Amass, which is functionally identical to Amass Orcs, except this time the army that is created is an orc army and not a zombie army. To amass Orcs N, you first determine if you control an army creature. If you do not, you create a 0/0 black orc army creature token and then put a number of +1/+1 counters onto it equal to the amass orcs number in your effect. This means that if you are instructed to amass orcs 2 and you do not already control an army, you'll make a 2/2 token. But if you already have a 2/2 army token, you'll simply put 2 more +1/+1 counters on that token. As an example, let's take a look at Swarming of Moria, which is 2 in a red for a sorcery that creates a treasure token and amasses orcs 2. This means that you either create a 0/0 army with 2 counters on it if you don't already have an army, or you put 2 counters on an army you already control. Build those armies tall and follow them into battle. Before we jump into the returning mechanics for this set, a quick message from me. Thanks, me. Set review season is the perfect time to consider supporting the channel via the Patreon. We have several tiers over at the Daily Draft Patreon with rewards including access to my tier lists, early access to content, and access to the Daily Drafters Discord server. I'm incredibly proud of all the work on my tier lists, and here's an example of what these tier lists look like for March of the Machine, and as you'll see, I use a traditional A through F rating for every single card. I let you know if the card has moved up or down since my last update, and I give you the ability to hover over every single card and their card name to see a picture and clickable link to Scryfall. You'll also see that I customize tiers for every single draftable deck in the entire format, so if you're past Pack One Pick One and you want to know how I rank cards within certain archetypes, I've got customized ratings for every single draftable archetype as well. I'm currently working on my Lord of the Rings list and will have this released to Patreons in the Centaur Courser rewards tier as soon as I'm finished, guaranteed before the release of the set. If $5 is a bit too rich for your blood, we have $3 and $1 tiers that come with early access to content and admission to the Discord server, a great place to hang out and discuss all the happenings of a brand new set. And if a monetary donation isn't your speed, a subscription to the channel is also greatly appreciated and contribution enough. Thanks for your consideration, and now back to the set review content. Our first true returning mechanic in this set is food tokens. A food token is an artifact token with the ability to pay 2 generic mana, tap it, and sacrifice it to gain 3 life. That's it. In the case of Bill the Pony here, he comes with 2 food tokens when he enters, but he can also sacrifice food tokens to make your creatures fight with their butts for a turn. There are several synergies that revolve around food in this set, whether it's simply that you created one, that you sacrificed one, or how many you have, so keep an eye out for food synergies as you draft. Land cycling returns in Tales of Middle-earth, just as we most recently saw in March of the Machine, and it functions just how it most recently did. You simply pay the listed cost, which in this set will always appear as 1 generic mana, and discard the card to search your library for a card with the appropriate basic land type, reveal it, and put it into your hand. In the case of the Troll of Khazad-dûm, he can either be a 6-mana 6/5 that has Super Menace, or you can pay 1 generic mana to discard him to go search your library for a swamp. Sagas are back, which makes all sorts of sense as they represent epic stories and tales that play out 1 chapter at a time over a series of turns. Each saga enters the battlefield with a lore counter on it, causing the first ability, the Chapter 1 ability, to trigger. After your main phase begins, you add another lore counter and the next chapter ability triggers. This happens until the last chapter ability has finished. Once that happens, you sacrifice the saga. In the case of the Book of Mazarbul, when it enters the battlefield, you will simply amass 1. On your next turn, you will amass 2, and then on your third turn, creatures you control will get +1/+0 and gain menace until end of turn. Then you will sacrifice the Book of Mazarbul. Sagas are great representations of the tales and stories of Middle-earth, so it's great to see them return here. A returning term in this set is historic. Historic is a term that refers to artifacts, sagas, and anything that is legendary. Lost to Legend is a spell that puts a historic permanent into its owner's library 4th from the top, and it even reminds you what exactly a historic permanent is as well. There will be cards in this set that mention historic permanents, so as long as you know what types of permanents are historic, you should be good to go. And the final returning mechanic that we have in Tales of Middle-earth are stun counters. If a tapped creature with 1 or more stun counters on it would untap, instead it stays tapped and 1 stun counter is removed from it. This can be because it's the untap step, or because a spell or ability tries to untap the creature, but remember that a stun counter is only removed if the creature is tapped. Scroll of Isildur is a saga that can put stun counters on creatures with its 2nd chapter, and reward you for keeping those creatures tapped down in its 3rd chapter by drawing you extra cards. With that look at the mechanics out of the way, let's take a look at the first archetype for today's video. The first archetype we will cover today is Red-White, which is a deck advertised as a humans aggro deck. We get Red-White aggro almost every set, so let's see if the humans can provide this deck with the tools it needs to win. We actually get 2 signpost uncommons for each archetype in this set, so we will start with Theoden, King of Rohan, which is a 3-mana 2/3 that can give creatures double strike as he and other humans enter the battlefield, an explosively aggressive ability. And our second signpost of Red-White is Shadowfax, Lord of Horses, which doesn't necessarily synergize with the whole humans thing, but boy is it an aggressive ability, allowing you to potentially get another 2 or 3 drop onto the battlefield attacking for free. What good would an aggressive tribal deck be without aggressive creatures in that tribe? So let's take a look at some of the humans in these colors, starting with Haradrim Spearmaster, which can give another creature a temporary power boost. Errand Rider of Gondor effectively loots when it enters, but if you control a legendary creature, you don't have to bottom the card. Protector of Gondor is a 3/3 human that comes with another 1/1 human. Rohirrim Lancer is an aggressive 1-drop with menace and upside when it dies. Erkenbrand, Lord of Westfold, buffs your entire team when a human enters. Esquire of the King is another cheap creature with upside later in the game. Eastmark Cavalier is a 2/2 with Vigilance and effectively Death Touch against orcs and goblins. And Rally at the Hornburg creates 2 1/1 humans and also gives your humans haste if you're able to double spell. Any good aggro deck needs a few combat tricks to push through, and in Red-White we have access to Rush the Room, which gives +1/+0 in first strike. Second Breakfast gives +2/+1 to 2 different creatures. Escape the Orthanc gives +1/+3 and flying and even untaps the creature. And Gimli's Fury gives +3/+2 and even trample if the creature happens to be legendary. As you've probably noticed, each of the first few categories in each archetype will focus on only commons and uncommons, but let's go ahead and take a look at some of the rares and mythics in these colors, beginning with Mary Esquire of Rohan, which is a 2/2 with haste, has equipment upside, and draws you cards if you have another attacking legendary creature. Boromir, Warden of the Tower, is a 3/3 with vigilance that can sacrifice itself to protect the rest of your board. And Eowyn, Fearless Knight, also has haste and can immediately exile a larger creature when it enters, and gives your legendaries protection from that creature's colors. Next up we have Blue-White, which has a couple of themes beginning with Evasion as a win con, and drawing 2 cards per turn as a value engine. Our first signpost uncommon is Gwaihir the Windlord, which is a 4/4 with flying and vigilance that can also be cheaper if you've drawn 2 cards this turn. And our other signpost is Prince Imrahil the Fair, which pays you off for drawing 2 cards per turn by giving you 1/1 humans. Let's first take a look at some of the common and uncommon creatures with evasion for this deck, beginning with Eagles of the North, which is an expensive flyer, but gives a nice buff and attacks to your creatures when it enters, as well as has the ability to be cycled for 1 mana. Landraval Horizon Witness can jump your creatures into the air and give them evasion. Nimrodel Watcher can become unblockable whenever you scry. Ithilien Kingfisher is a 2/1 flyer that dies to draw you a card. Soldier of the Grey Host is a flyer with flash that can also buff another creature when it enters, and Willow Wind is a flyer that scries 2 when it enters. Let's now take a look at some of the enablers and payoffs for drawing 2 cards per turn, beginning with Faramir Field Commander, which draws you a card on your end step if a creature you control died this turn. Aaron Rider of Gondor draws a card when it ETBs and lets you keep it if you control a legendary creature. Stalwarts of Osgiliath gets a +1/+1 counter whenever you draw your second card. The Bath Song draws you 2 cards 2 turns in a row. Birthday Escape is a cheap 1 mana way to draw your second card on your turn. Hithlane Knots can draw you a card on your opponent's turn, so if you can find a way to draw another at instant speed, you'll get your triggers. Council's Deliberation draws a card at instant speed and can do so again when you scry. Arwen's Gift draws 2 cards. Ithilien Kingfisher draws a card when it dies. Captain of Umbar can draw you an extra card every single turn. And Knights of Dol Amroth also gets a +1/+1 counter on it whenever you draw your second card. Some rares and mythics to look out for in this deck include Pippin, Guard of the Citadel, which is a 2 mana 2/2 with vigilance, ward 1, and can give another creature protection until end of turn. Faramir, Prince of Ithilien, either draws you a card or makes 3 1/1s every single turn, regardless of what your opponent does. And the Watcher in the Water pays you off for drawing cards on your opponent's turn by giving you 1/1s, and gives you extra value when they die. Next up we have Red-Black, which is an aggressively slanted Amass deck. Our first signpost uncommon is Mauhur Uruk-hai Captain, which is a 2/2 with Menace that also puts additional counters on your armies whenever you amass, and Ugluk of the White Hand gets additional counters on himself when creatures die, and even more when those creatures happen to be goblins or orcs. We'll first take a look at some of the amass enablers for this deck, which include Dunlin Crabane, which is a 1/1 flyer that amasses 2. The Torment of Gollum lets you nab a card from your opponent's hand and amasses 2. March from the Black Gate amasses 1 when it enters and whenever your amassed army attacks. And Easterling Vanguard amasses 1 when it dies. Some of the aggressive payoffs for doing all of this army building include Gothmog Morgue Lieutenant, which gives your amassed army and other creature tokens Death Touch. Mirkwood Bats pings your opponent for 1 every time you create a new army or sacrifice that army. Foray of Orcs amasses 2 and then pings a creature equal to the amassed army's power. Lash of the Balrog lets you sacrifice your small army to kill a creature so you can create another army. Cirith Ungol Patrol lets you sacrifice your army to draw cards and make food tokens. Grima Wormtongue also lets you sack your creatures to ping your opponent and lets you amass if that creature was legendary. And Grishnok, Brash Instigator amasses 2 and then can steal a creature for the turn. Some rares and mythics to look out for in this deck include the Balrog Durin's Bane, which can become cheaper if anyone's sacrificed permanents, has haste, can't be blocked except by legendaries, and kills a creature when it dies. Shagrat Loot Bearer is a bit of an equipment synergy and can amass to pay you off for it. And Orcish Bowmasters can shoot down small creatures and amass 1 if your opponent is drawing too many cards. Next up we have Red-Green, which is advertised as a ramp deck that cares about creatures with high power. We'll first look at Strider, Ranger of the North, which is a 4/4 with landfall that buffs your creature's stats, and if they have power 4 or greater, they also gain first strike until end of turn. We also have Friendly Rivalry, which is a removal spell in green-red that gets slightly better if you're able to include a few legendaries in your deck. Let's first take a look at some common and uncommon ramp enablers for this deck, and honestly, I didn't find many. Woe's Pathfinder is a 2-mana 1/1 mana dork, which is usually fine if that's the sort of thing you need. Swarming of Moria is effectively a 3-mana 2/2 that makes a treasure in this deck, and Entish Restoration is a ramp spell that gets even better if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. So, what are the payoffs for ramping and having large creatures out? Well, Warbeast of Gorgoroth lets you amass 2 whenever it or another large creature you control dies. Oliphant is a huge trampler that buffs your other creatures and gives them trample as well, and also has cycling for just 1 mana. Quick Beam Upstart Ent gives huge buffs to your team whenever it or another Treefolk enters, and Treefolks do tend to be large. Ent's Fury is a fight spell that gets even better if you have a creature with power 4 or greater. And Eomer of the Rittermark gives you a 1/1 when it attacks if you control the creature with the greatest power on the board. Some rares and mythics to look out for in this deck include Doors of Durin, which lets you scry 2 whenever you attack, and then put creature cards into play for free, tapped and attacking, and even gives them bonuses if you control dwarves or elves. Gimli Mournful Avenger grows when creatures you control die and has additional bonuses if you can make several trades. And Delighted Halfling is a 1-drop mana dork for this deck, assuming you have some legendaries you want to ramp out. Next up we have Black-Green, which is a life and death deck. What that means is that it cares about sacrificing things for value and works with the graveyard to regrow and return things you've sacrificed. This archetype is also one of the 2 that cares the most about food tokens. We start with Rise of the Witch King, which makes each player sacrifice a creature, but lets you return a permanent from the graveyard to the battlefield as well. And Old Man Willow gets bigger with the number of lands you control and gives you a sack outlet when it attacks to kill smaller creatures your opponent controls. We'll first look at some of the sacrifice enablers and payoffs for the deck, including Shortcut to Mushrooms, which gives your creatures +1/+1 counters if permanents leave the battlefield from your control during your turn. Mushroom Watchdogs can sacrifice foods to get counters and vigilance. Mirkwood Bats can drain your opponent every time you create or sacrifice tokens. Mordor Trebuchet creates 2/1 artifact tokens that sacrifice themselves when you attack with orcs and goblins. Lash of the Balrog lets you sacrifice a creature to kill a creature for just 1 mana. Grima Wormtongue can tap to sacrifice creatures to ping your opponent. And Nasty End can sacrifice your creatures to turn them into more cards. Some of the graveyard synergies for sending all of these creatures to the yard include Sam's Desperate Rescue, which can bring back a creature from your graveyard to your hand for just 1 mana. Golem's Bite can exile itself from the graveyard to tempt you. Haunt of the Dead Marshes can keep returning itself from the graveyard if you have a legendary creature. Revive the Shire can return any permanent card to your hand. And Golem Patient Plotter can return to your hand by sacrificing other creatures as well. Some rares and mythics to look out for in this deck include One Ring to Rule Them All, which can mill cards into your yard and then is a board wipe in Chapter 2. Shelob, Child of Ungoliant is an insane amount of text on 1 card, but basically it's a 6-mana 8/8 with Ward 2 and some other spider synergies if you can assemble them. And Sauron the Necromancer can make copies of cards in your graveyard whenever it attacks and have them stick around if he's your ring bearer. Next up is Green-White, which is an aggro deck based around the food token mechanic. It claims to be an aggressive deck that uses food to its advantage. So let's start with the ring bearer of ring bearers himself, Frodo Baggins, who surprisingly doesn't really have much to do with the whole food thing, but is an aggressive creature that can tempt you multiple times and force a block if he's your current ring bearer. We also have Butterbur Bree Innkeeper, which does synergize with food as he creates one every single turn for you if you don't already have one. Let's first look at some of the food creators and enablers for the deck, starting with Meriadoc Brandybuck, which creates a food every time a halfling attacks. Brandywine Farmer makes a food when it enters or leaves the battlefield. Second Breakfast is a combat trick that comes with some food, and East Farthing Farmer makes a food on ETB and gives a creature a nice buff based on the number of food that you have. So what are our payoffs for making all of this food? Well, Pippin's Bravery is a combat trick that becomes great if you sacrifice a food. Peregrine Took can double the amount of food you're making. Mushroom Watchdogs can eat that food to get counters and vigilance. Rosie Cotton of South Lane gives out counters whenever you make tokens, and even comes with one herself. Shire Sheriff lets you sacrifice a food to exile a creature until it leaves the battlefield. Nimble Hobbit can tap down a creature when it attacks by sacrificing a food. And Bill the Pony is just the bestest of boys and has never done anything wrong ever. Some rares and mythics to look out for in this deck include Samwise Gamgee, which makes a food whenever a non-token creature enters and can return historic cards by sacrificing some of those foods. Aragorn Company Leader is just a great aggressive creature with some temptation synergies that will snowball very quickly. And Arwen Mortal Queen is another incredible value for the mana cost and the ability to distribute +1/+1 counters and lifelink counters amongst your board. Next up is Blue-Green, which is another deck with two sub-themes, and the two present here are Elf, Tribal, and Scrying Matters. This deck rewards you for scrying and also has elf synergies. We'll start with Legolas Counter of Kills, which lets you untap him whenever you scry and gets bigger as your opponent's creatures die. And we also have Arwen Undamiel, which puts counters on creatures whenever you scry and even comes with the ability to scry herself. Let's first look at some of the important elves for the deck, which also thankfully seem to have several scrying synergies built in, starting with Lothlorien Lookout, which scries one whenever it attacks. Glorfindel Dauntless Rescuer is an elf that gets bigger as you scry and has two very powerful aggressive abilities. Galadrim Guide is an elf that enters and scries 2. Chance Met Elves gets a counter on itself whenever you scry. Celeborn the Wise scries whenever you attack with elves and gets bigger the more cards you look at. Nimrodel Watcher is an elf that gets unblockable when you scry. Greyhaven's Navigator has flash and scries on ETB. And Elrond, Lord of Rivendell, scries whenever creatures enter the battlefield under your control. Now, we just saw tons of both enablers and payoffs for the scrying, but some non-elves for the deck that can help you out are Elven Farsight that scries 3 for just 1 mana. Council's Deliberation allows you to draw an extra card from your graveyard whenever you scry, and Arwen's Gift scries 2 and draws 2 cards. Some rares and mythics to look out for in this deck include Elrond, Master of Healing, which is an incredible payoff for this deck, giving out counters and even letting you draw cards if your opponents want to mess with those creatures. Galadriel of Lothlorien has the ability to scry 3 and ramp if you get a little lucky. And Lost Isle Calling is an enchantment that gets counters whenever you scry and can draw an insane amount of cards and give you an extra turn if you have enough counters. Next up is Blue-Black, which is similar to Black-Red in that it cares about amass, but this is more of a control deck than an aggro deck. You'll see cards here that also showed up in Black-Red, but also a few more to control the game. We'll start with an interesting signpost uncommon that doesn't really seem to have too much to do with amassing or controlling, but we have Ring Sight, which is a card that tempts you, and then is some sort of conditional tutor, not really good to be honest. But we also have the Mouth of Sauron, which comes with an amass army as big as the number of instant and sorcery cards in someone's graveyard after they mill 3, ideally your own. Let's first look at some of the amass synergies in the deck, beginning with the Torment of Gollum, which lets you nab a card from their hand and amass 2. Mordor Muster lets you draw a card and lose a life, but also amass 1. Surrounded by Orcs amasses 3, then makes someone, again ideally yourself, mill equal to your army's power. Saruman the White amasses 2 whenever you cast your second spell each turn. Saruman's Trickery counters a spell and also amasses 1. And Treason of Isengard amasses 2 while returning an instant or sorcery to the top of your library. Some of the classic control elements in this deck include Glorious Gale, which counters a creature spell and tempts you if the spell was legendary. Claim the Precious kills a creature and tempts you. Isolation at Orthanc puts a creature back into its owner's library. And Gollum's Bite is a disfigure variant that can tempt you from the graveyard for just some extra mana. Some rares and mythics to look out for in this deck include Sauron's Ransom, which is some decent card draw at instant speed for the deck. Lobelia Sackville Baggins has Flash and Menace and can also exile a creature card from a graveyard and give you treasure. and Isildur's Fateful Strike can destroy a creature and potentially make your opponent exile some cards from their hand. Next up is Blue-Red, which claims to be a deck that cares about both the wizard's creature type and the traditional spell's matter theme that it always seems to get. We'll see if the wizards can keep up with the humans and the elves that we've already seen, beginning with Gandalf's Sanction, which is a removal spell that effectively has trample, and Bilbo Retired Burglar, which strangely isn't a wizard, nor does it care about instants or sorceries, so I'm not exactly sure why it's a blue-red uncommon, but here he is. We'll start with the notable wizards at common and uncommon, and for a deck that claims to care so much about wizards, we have literally just two. Gandalf, Friend of the Shire, gives you the ability to cast your sorcery spells at instant speed and can draw you cards when the ring tempts you, and his mortal enemy Saruman the White can amass 2 every time you cast your second spell each turn, which for a deck that will likely operate at instant speed will come in handy. We won't highlight them all, but a few of the spells and spell payoffs for this deck include Treason of Isengard, which amasses 2 and can return an instant or sorcery to the top of your library. Pelargir Survivor is a mana dork for your instants and sorceries. Ranger's Firebrand can deal 2 to any target and tempts you. Fiery Inscription domes your opponent for 2 with every spell you cast. And Smite the Deathless is Red's classic deal 3 for 2 in this set. Some rares and mythics to look out for in this deck include Gandalf the Grey, which gives you all sorts of modality every time you cast an instant or sorcery. Flame of Anor also gives you a good amount of modality for 3 mana and can also give you an extra mode if you control a wizard. And Press the Enemy is a bounce spell that lets you cast another spell from your hand for free. Our last archetype is Black-White, which is the deck that claims to care the most about all of the legendary creatures running around and the ring tempting you. Now, like some of the other signpost uncommons, our Black-White signposts have effectively nothing to do with either of those things, but I'll show them to you anyway, starting with Denethor Ruling Steward, which can create 1/1s if a creature died under your control this turn and also sacrifice creatures to drain your opponent, and Shadow Summoning, which is just 2 mana for 2 1/1 flyers. Not a bad deal, to be honest. Now, most of the legendary payoffs were at rare and mythic, but a few of the uncommon legendaries you might not be troubled to include in this deck include Faramir Field Commander, which can draw cards on your end step and also create 1/1s whenever the ring tempts you. Gothmog Morgul Lieutenant amasses 1 and gives your tokens Death Touch. Samwise the Stout-Hearted has flash and can return a permanent card from your graveyard to your hand and also tempts you. And Gollum Patient Plotter can return from your graveyard to your hand by sacking other creatures and also tempts you when he leaves the battlefield. Some of the better non-legendary ways to be tempted in this deck include Claim the Precious, which is a removal spell that also tempts you. Slip on the Ring can blink a creature you own while also tempting you. Took Reaper is a cheap creature that dies and tempts you. And Gollum's Bite can be exiled from your graveyard to tempt you. Some rares and mythics to look out for in this deck, and there were plenty that I won't even mention here, include Lotho Corrupt Sheriff, which is a 2 mana 2/1 that creates extra treasures for you without you having to do much work. Flowering of the White Tree is an anthem for your whole team and a super anthem for your legendaries. And Gandalf the White gives your other legendaries and artifact spells flash and doubles up the death triggers from legendaries or artifacts. Thanks so much for sticking around until the end of this video. If you are still here, I'm always excited for the release of this video because I know it'll be very beneficial to have all of this information in one place so that you have an easy way to find what you need if you wish to revisit the video throughout the week. If you enjoyed this content, feel free to share it with a friend or two, as there is a decent chance they might as well. If you've already subscribed to the channel, thanks for being here today. And if you're not, go ahead and click that red subscribe button to stay on top of set review season and have access to consistent high quality draft content as soon as the set launches on Arena. Looks like that'll do it for this video, and I'll see you next time here at Daily Draft.